The subcommittee will come to order. Thank you to the subcommittee members and certainly our witnesses today for joining us for the second Trade Subcommittee hearing of the 119th Congress. This hearing is another opportunity for members to articulate their trade priorities ahead of the significant steps we anticipate in the implementation of President Trump's America First trade policy in April. First and foremost, I am confident we will build upon the historic trade negotiation successes of President Trump's first term. In 4 years, the Trump administration was able to fundamentally alter the trajectory of U.S. trade policy through new agreements with our top trading partners, including the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA as we know, the China Phase 1 Agreement, and the United States-Japan Trade Agreement. These agreements tore down a litany of tariff and non-tariff barriers facing American farmers, manufacturers, and service providers to level the playing field for American industry and workers. They achieved fair and reciprocal treatment for the U.S. and enjoyed substantial support within Congress, among my constituents, and with many stakeholders across our country. Further, President Trump sought to continue this momentum through comprehensive trade negotiations with the UK and Kenya, both of which were strongly supported by many of the members here today and on both sides of the aisle. Unfortunately, this progress was hindered by a passive trade agenda during the last 4 years. Meaningful talks with the UK and Kenya were stalled or replaced with, quote, frameworks and dialogues, end quote, and effective enforcement of most aspects of our trade agreements was put on hold. Meanwhile, our adversaries forged ahead. China remains active throughout the world, striking new trade agreements which spread its malign influence and shape the global economy according to its priorities. Further, our friends and allies put in place new discriminatory barriers against our companies and producers with little fear of a strong U.S. response. This is why I'm appreciative of the Trump administration's renewed engagement with our trading partners starting day one. This engagement will be key to new bilateral or sectoral trade agreement negotiations while conducting a comprehensive assessment of global tariff and non-tariff barriers to prioritize through trade negotiations. Our witnesses here today represent a wide range of sectors within the economy, including agriculture, manufacturing, and services. I look forward to hearing from all of you as you highlight opportunities and barriers which need to be addressed through strategic trade negotiations. I will note, while this sector is not directly represented on today's panel, there are also significant opportunities to increase U.S. energy exports. I'm very glad to see President Trump's leadership in increasing U.S. energy dominance. I am proud to represent Nebraska's 3rd District, which leads the nation in agriculture production. Producers in my district know firsthand how critical trade is, especially considering American farmers and ranchers face the highest tariffs. With trade agreements which eliminate these barriers, our farmers thrive. For example, among our top 5 beef export destinations, American producers receive preferential tariff treatment through existing trade agreements with 4 of them. When given a level playing field, American producers win. The same is true for manufacturing. Today we'll hear from Harley-Davidson about some egregious tariff barriers facing American motorcycle exports. When American companies can grow and compete, both at home and abroad, we share culture, increase global ties, and strengthen our economy. With fair treatment abroad, American manufacturing can thrive and exports will grow. Without it, American workers and consumers are harmed. In services, America is the clear global leader. We rely on fair treatment and access to markets abroad to maintain our competitive edge. A robust services sector strengthens our economy and allows American manufacturing and agriculture to thrive, increasing jobs and growing our economy. The challenges and opportunities in each of these sectors make clear we must get back to the negotiating table and do so from a position of strength. I look forward to working with Ambassador Greer and Secretary Lutnick to build on areas of success in our current trade agreements while moving forward aggressively to enforce all aspects of those agreements and eliminate additional barriers to U.S. exports around the world. I now recognize Ranking Member Ms. Sanchez for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for holding today's hearing, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. As the ranking member of the Trade Subcommittee, I want to see new trade agreements with partners committed to advancing worker rights, protecting the environment, providing access to medicines, defending human rights, safeguarding our intellectual property, fighting against corruption, and creating the conditions for fair competition. But this cannot be done without a trusted negotiating partner in the White House, one who thinks solely about what's best for the American people and its workers, and a Republican Party ready to stand with us to protect the Constitution and the rule of law. Since our last Trade Subcommittee hearing only a month ago, President Trump has recklessly thrown around tariff authority against our closest trading partners. Congress delegated national security and trade authority to prior presidents under the belief that they could be trusted with that power. But in less than 70 days, we have seen how President Trump distorts and weaponizes that delegated authority to serve his own interest, settle old scores, and most alarming of all, to destabilize America's economic and security standing in the world. The president's trade wars have trampled the rule of law and the legal framework American businesses rely on for trade with Canada and Mexico. As we will hear from Mr. Jonathan Root today, the president's trade war prompted Canada to retaliate with a 25% tariff on all American motorcycles, including union-made Harleys from Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. American businesses, including the creative industry, are fighting trade barriers in Canada and Mexico have been just one casualty of this trade war. And to top it all off, the president appears hell-bent on acquiring Greenland, annexing Canada, and pillaging the natural resources of our trading partners. The administration's gutting of federal agencies has also hurt American businesses who rely on them to enforce worker and environmental rights. We cannot afford to have the federal government stop advocating for American ranchers and farmers facing SPS barriers overseas, for U.S. service providers fighting technical trade barriers, and for creative and tech sectors facing intellectual property theft abroad. President Trump's attempt to circumvent Congress, dismantle our federal government, and act as the sole arbiter of the U.S. trade policy are an assault on the constitutional norms that have guided congressional leadership on trade since the beginning of America's founding. I look forward to hearing from Professor Clausen about the importance of congressional authority over trade. House Democrats should not stand alone in fighting to reassert our congressional authority. I want to remind my Republican colleagues that last Congress, this committee unanimously approved legislation sponsored by Chairman Jason Smith, noting a president lacks the authority to enter into binding trade agreements absent approval from Congress. If President Trump seeks to enter into a binding trade agreement with any country, he must seek congressional approval. House Democrats are willing to work across the aisle to craft trade agreements that can garner broad bipartisan support in Congress. During the first Trump administration's renegotiation of NAFTA, House Democrats fought for better labor and environmental standards, access to medicines, and closing enforcement loopholes. Despite the president's initial pushback, we created a new facility-specific labor enforcement mechanism that has delivered real gains for workers in America and abroad. We were successful in making these demands because the president knew he needed congressional votes to approve his updated NAFTA. I hope this hearing will be an opportunity for this body to lay out bipartisan priorities in trade negotiations and reclaim congressional prerogatives. I look forward to hearing the testimony from our witnesses, and I thank the chairman and yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our witnesses for today's hearing. Robbie Kirkland is chairman of the Texas Cattle Feeders Association. Jonathan Root is chief financial officer and president of commercial for Harley-Davidson, Inc. Meredith Broadbent is non-resident senior advisor, economics program, and Scholl chair in international business at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Christine Bliss is president of the Coalition of Services Industries, and Kathleen Clausen is professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives, your insights, and certainly promotion of some great American products, whether it's beef or some motorcycles. Glad to say that Nebraska workers help that logo on those motorcycles shine all the more. There's great things happening across America right now, even amidst some of the struggles that exist. But I hope to, and I know we will hear good perspectives moving forward here from our witnesses as you can share your insights. The light you will see in front of you, green obviously means keep going. Yellow means start to wrap it up. And certainly red means it's time for the next one. So Mr. Kirkland will begin, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Robbie Kirkland, and I am the Vice President and General Manager of Kirkland Feed Yard, my family's third-generation farm, ranch, and feedlot operation near Vega, Texas. I'm also the chairman of Texas Cattle Feeders Association, where I'm a member. Our members feed and market 25% of the U.S. fed cattle. I'm here today on behalf of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, where I serve as a board of director. NCBA has been the trusted leader and definitive voice of the U.S. cattle and beef industry since 1898, and I'm honored to share our perspective on the importance of international trade. The United States has some of the safest and most efficient production practices in the world, and we utilize science and technology to produce 18% of the world's beef, with 6% of the world's cattle, while generating only 2% of the U.S. greenhouse gases. Consumers at home and abroad trust U.S. beef. 85% of U.S. beef is consumed by Americans, but there are certain cuts and products like short ribs, tongues, livers, and other organ meats with strong consumer demand in Asia and Latin America. Even facing global economic headwinds, demand for U.S. beef remains strong. In 2024, we exported $10.45 billion worth of beef, which equates to a value of $415 per head of fed cattle. Korea, Japan, and China accounted for 58% of our total beef exports. Removed trade barriers and gave us competitive market access. But over the past few years, the U.S. government has done little to expand our footprint abroad, while our competitors aggressively secured access to the markets, and we need to re-engage and level the playing field. Unfortunately, U.S. beef faces a 50% tariff in Thailand, a 30% tariff in Vietnam, and many non-tariff barriers in Australia, Europe, and China. We need Congress and the Trump administration to ensure fair trade in these markets, while securing new agreements with allies like the United Kingdom. As you know, Americans love ground beef, but we don't produce enough lean grind in the U.S. to satisfy domestic demand. Therefore, we do import beef from other countries to combine with our trimmings to help meet domestic demand and ensure affordability for ground beef. We must ensure any country that is granted access to the U.S. does not put U.S. consumers or U.S. cattle herd at risk. This is a major concern with Brazil, Paraguay, and other countries that have had a history of foot and mouth disease and highly questionable record on food and animal health. We need Congress and President Trump to hold these partners accountable and ensure the safety of American consumers and our cattle herd. There's a long mutual beneficial history of the cattle and beef trade between U.S., Mexico, and Canada. This partnership is devised and competitive due to the success of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. Most of the North American cattle fed and processed capacity is in the United States. Cattle imports represent 2% of our overall cattle herd and only 6.5% of our total beef harvest. Cattle imports fill seasonal lows in the feed yards and packing plants and keep them running at optimal capacity, especially in the Southwest. Demand for U.S. beef is on the rise because of its strong reputation and safety, quality, and positive eating experience. Americans' farmers and ranchers have benefited from the market-driven, science-based trade policies that we must continue to remove, and we must continue to remove the trade barriers so that U.S. cattle producers can capitalize on overseas consumer demand. Thank you for allowing me to provide my perspective on this important topic, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kirkland. Now I recognize Mr. Root for 5 minutes.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Sanchez, distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Trade and members of the full Ways and Means Committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity today to present on such an important issue. My name is Jonathan Root. I am the President of Commercial and Chief Financial Officer at Harley-Davidson. Back in 1903, our founders, William Harley and Arthur, William, and Walter Davidson, sparked a transportation revolution and a motorcycle culture that would grow and spread across generations and geographies. 122 years later, as a global manufacturer, we still proudly and authentically stand up for the things we believe in most: the rebel spirit in all of us, unity, individuality, and personal freedom. Today, Harley-Davidson employs over 5,500 people globally, of which over 4,500 are employed in the United States, including those with the IAM and USW unions across our manufacturing sites in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. While our corporate headquarters is still a stone's throw away from the original work shed in downtown Milwaukee, Wisconsin, our powertrain operations in Menominee Falls create the heartbeat of our motorcycles and transmissions for all of our Harley-Davidson motorcycles. In Tomahawk, north central Wisconsin, we have been making motorcycle parts for nearly 60 years. And in Pennsylvania, our York Vehicle Operations Plant has been a staple in the local community for over 50 years. With almost 1,300 employees working there, 3 assembly lines build 33 iconic models of American-designed and developed motorcycles with our skilled American union employees. As I mentioned previously, while proudly American, Harley-Davidson is also a global company. We have a facility in Brazil where we assemble motorcycles and powertrains using sub-assembled kits from our Tomahawk and York plants for our customers in Brazil. I would like to note that this facility was created in direct response to trade barriers erected by the Brazilian government intended to limit imports. Lastly, we also have a facility in Thailand that allows us to manufacture closer to growing markets in that region and to benefit from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership as part of the ASEAN initiative. The U.S. has long been and remains the key market for heavyweight motorcycles with engines larger than 601 cubic centimeters. Wisconsin and Pennsylvania-made motorcycles account for over 95% of our U.S. sales. The U.S. remains our largest workforce, our largest country of production, and accounts for the majority of Harley-Davidson's global sales. However, we are under incredible pressures at home and abroad through uneven and unfair trade practices. I'd like to highlight the scale of the imbalance. As you are likely aware, the EU has scheduled a devastating total tariff of 56% for Harley-Davidson motorcycles, meaning 50 percentage points is retaliatory tariff plus the base 6 percentage points import duty, irrespective of the place of their manufacture. This is a shocking comparison to the 0 to 2.4% import duty that international motorcycle brands are able to take advantage of when accessing the U.S. market, whether they manufacture these in Europe, Asia, or elsewhere. It should be noted that from 2018 to 2021, Harley-Davidson exports to the EU have already faced an additional 25% tariff, which costs an estimated $166 million as we tried to avoid passing costs on to customers in an attempt to secure the company's future in Europe. However, a 56% tariff is indefensible and will impact our ability to sell motorcycles in Europe. Continuing with retaliatory tariffs, a 25% tariff is currently being applied to all motorcycles imported into Canada from the U.S. since March 4th, another clear effort to politically target Harley-Davidson as an American icon. Harley-Davidson competes in other foreign markets with luxury taxes up to 150%, as well as additional non-tariff barriers related to everything from licensing barriers to emissions pricing. Using Denmark in the EU to further emphasize my point, a Harley-Davidson Road Glide, after adding a 25% VAT and an incredible 150% luxury tax, already costs the customer around $77,000 US. But should the EU's additional 50% retaliatory tariff be applied, this would balloon the price of this motorcycle in Denmark to an eye-watering $124,000, over 4 times the cost to a customer in the US, where this model starts from $28,000. What was a dream of personal expression and freedom on the road is turned into an unattainable luxury for many prospective Harley-Davidson customers in Europe. Turning to Asia, many customers levy high duties and high taxes on motorcycles coming from the U.S. as standard practice. A few examples of duties and taxes associated with U.S.-produced motorcycles follow. Thailand imposes a 60% import duty, a 30% excise tax, and a 7% VAT. Indonesia charges a 40% import duty, an exorbitant 95% luxury tax, and 12% VAT. Vietnam has an import duty of 40%, an excise duty of 21%, and 8% VAT. And India has historically imposed a 100% import duty on U.S. motorcycles, 3% excise duty, and 28% VAT. All the countries I mentioned as examples have no import duties on motorcycles from other ASEAN countries as part of negotiated trade agreements among those countries. Lastly, I would like to mention China, which also imposes high tariffs, 30% import duty, and 25% retaliatory tariffs, and 13% VAT, and a cascade of non-tariff barriers. Harley-Davidson supports a fair and reciprocal U.S. trade agenda with our trading partners. For too long, the trade policy imbalance has permitted manufacturers to use cheap labor, cheap duties from developing and emerging economies to enter the U.S. market at a distinct advantage over companies that remain dedicated to the American worker, like Harley-Davidson. While at the same time, our U.S.-made vehicles are met with huge import tariffs and other restrictions to enter other markets. My ask here today is a simple one, and that is fairness. It is very clear that Harley-Davidson is being discriminated against and politically targeted by the EU and Canada. Moreover, competitor brands should not be allowed to take advantage of low-cost manufacturing and preferential import duty when accessing the U.S. market. I want to thank the committee again for the opportunity to testify. As you continue your important work to create a more level playing field for American manufacturers, I remain at your disposal to share Harley-Davidson's experience and, most importantly, to help reduce barriers to American motorcycles and ensure fair treatment for our company.
Thank you, Mr. Root. Ms. Broadbent, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome back to the committee room. As a Ways and Means alumni staffer, welcome back.
I appreciate it. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Sanchez, and members of the committee, of the subcommittee, it's a privilege to speak with you about American trade negotiation priorities, an area of huge opportunity and responsibility. I'm currently a senior advisor, non-resident at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and these views are my own. Trade negotiation priorities are front and center for the U.S. economy and for your constituents. Each of you brings to this debate a keen grasp of the impact of American trade policies on the workers and businesses and farmers in your district. Congress should work with the administration to pursue a comprehensive trade and investment agreement with the United Kingdom that includes tailored approaches to the challenging security, trade, and tech issues facing both countries. President Trump and Prime Minister Starmer have re-engaged on this, and the chairman's bill, H.R. 1743, sets out bipartisan goals and procedures. Further cementing bilateral trade relations with a close ally will give U.S. trade negotiators the opportunity to craft state-of-the-art provisions that reflect the similarity of our countries in terms of advanced industries, working conditions, and environmental regulations. A comprehensive trade agreement will have the added benefit of clearly re-legislating congressional digital trade negotiating objectives that have been undermined internationally by the previous administration's decision to retreat on these issues at the WTO. Current geopolitical tensions push the U.S. and the UK to rely less on China as an export market and source of imports. Industrial supply chains in both countries are reorganizing. The UK faces conflict in Europe, and China has aligned with Russia against key U.S. and UK national security interests. China floods world markets with excess manufactured products such as EVs, solar panels, and batteries, and is coming online with a large volume of subsidized aircraft. Manufacturing in the U.S. and UK industrial towns has been swamped. The two governments have the opportunity to construct a common trade remedy response mechanism to address non-market economy trade practices resulting in overcapacity being dumped onto world markets. Since Brexit, the UK has pushed hard to conclude trade agreements. It has recently been accepted as the first new member of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Commanding the world's largest consumer market, the U.S. remains the world's most sought-after trade agreement partner. Moving ahead now with a strategically chosen partner capitalizes on this advantage. As other economies grow and develop over time, the U.S. advantage will decline. Moving ahead now would best position the U.S. to achieve its job-creating objectives. Concluding an agreement with the U.K. would rejuvenate American influence and over trade and regulation. Grassroots frustration with heavy-handed regulation is at least rhetorically behind Brexit and figures prominently in British politics. The UK maintains legacy regulations from its prior membership in the EU. Virtually all exporting sectors of the U.S. economy, including agriculture, services, and manufacturing, see an agreement with the UK as an opportunity to innovate in regulatory cooperation on standards and product approvals. According to U.S. industry, many UK regulations are unnecessarily restrictive, non-science-based approaches that, for example, require U.S. manufacturers to ban or impose costly restrictions on substances based on possible but unproven risk. In joining CPTPP, the UK has taken a step toward embracing the USMCA model of respecting WTO TBT principles for determining legitimate international standards. This model, defined by domestic procedures for adequacy and mutual recognition, is the most constructive path for opening the UK market to many U.S. exports. U.S. and UK negotiators should focus on 4 goals: building on USMCA, the provisions of which are road-tested and agreed to on a bipartisan basis in the U.S., and they stand as state-of-the-art for trade agreements globally. Promoting innovative mechanisms to harmonize and improve selected regulatory procedures in the UK, which currently adheres largely to EU regulatory practice, where goals of consumer safety are the same, as they almost always are, but tough domestic politics resist harmonization of regulation. Mutual recognition of each other's standards will be important. Reaching agreement between the world's 2 most digitally intensive economies on rules for data flows, a sector that will drive the future of both economies, is critically important. These rules can then be replicated globally. And finally, we should achieve a meeting of the minds with the UK on a fair and transparent trade remedy mechanism for protecting both countries' industries from harmful non-market economy practices. The overall benefit of a US-UK trade deal is simple and obvious: improving the security and economic prospects of US and UK citizens and workers in the global economy. If the United States aspires to set standards for regulations that will be followed by other countries, a US-UK trade agreement is the next and most logical step. And it has the virtue of being doable. Missing the opportunity to strike a deal, particularly on regulatory principles and data flows, with such a well-matched, willing partner as the United Kingdom, would be really an enormous mistake. Thank you.
Thank you. Now recognized for 5 minutes, Ms. Bliss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You want to turn on your microphone there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sanchez, and subcommittee members. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today on the critical role of services and digital trade in advancing American negotiating priorities. My name is Christine Bliss, and I'm president of the Coalition of Services Industries, a nonprofit association representing U.S. service providers, including in financial services, technology, logistics, and media and entertainment sectors, just to name a few. Services are the backbone of the American economy. In 2023, the U.S. exported over $1 trillion in cross-border services, generating a trade surplus of nearly $280 billion. and U.S. services exports are 68% of gross U.S. exports. Even more significant are revenues from services delivered through foreign offices, which reached $2.1 trillion. Just as important, services are critical to supporting U.S. agriculture and manufacturing through logistics, financing, insurance, cloud services, digital payment services, and even soil testing and animal health monitoring. These services are critical for delivering manufactured goods and agricultural products and livestock worldwide. Services are increasingly delivered through digital means, which means we need trade frameworks not only for services, but for digital as well. High standard services and digital trade disciplines should be central to future U.S. trade agreements. Without them, the rise of global trade barriers threaten the U.S. competitive advantage in services and digital trade and our leadership in key technologies like AI. Just to give you an example, the OECD that tracks trade restrictiveness has documented a 25% increase in trade barriers to services and digital trade since 2013. The USMCA and the U.S.-Japan Digital Trade Agreement should be the building blocks for new agreements. Digital trade disciplines should include promotion of cross-border data flows, a prohibition against forced data localization, protection of source code and algorithms, and a ban on discrimination against U.S. digital content. It should also include a permanent ban on custom duties on electronic transmissions. The U.S. should also actively push back against discriminatory digital sovereignty requirements, digital services taxes, discriminatory online streaming legislation, and AI regulation that would undermine U.S. competitiveness. We should ensure that foreign governments accord fair treatment to U.S. technology firms and to electronic payment services providers. Disciplines on services, financial services, and investment should build on USMCA commitments, including the removal of foreign equity limits. In terms of priority markets, the UK should top the list of candidates for a comprehensive trade agreement, as noted in the chairman's bill, with high standard commitments on services, financial services, and digital trade, offering a robust template for other U.S. trade agreements. Moreover, the U.S. and UK have a strong and balanced bilateral trade relationship. With respect to India, the U.S. should prioritize the removal of persistent services and digital barriers and press forcefully for fair and equitable treatment of U.S. services and digital providers, greater market access, and India's support for extending the WTO e-commerce moratorium. On China, the U.S. government should enforce outstanding services commitments under Phase 1, particularly licensing of EPS services providers and services of U.S. and purchases of U.S. services. Another major concern is that as bilateral tensions have grown, Beijing has applied selective pressure to U.S. companies, seeking to intimidate them through targeted regulatory enforcement and anti-monopoly investigations. The U.S. government should address these in trade negotiations. In the USMCA review, the U.S. should work with Canada and Mexico to strengthen the agreement while addressing major trade frictions. These include Canada's DST and C11 audiovisual content legislation, and Mexico's concerning retroactive interpretation of its VAT tax, as well as its unfair treatment of U.S. electronic payment services and telecommunication providers. Regarding Korea, the U.S. should press for elimination of services and digital barriers, such as restrictions on cloud services, data localization, and discriminatory legislation and regulation with regard to platforms. The U.S. should also, and I want to pause here because I'm switching gears to sectoral agreements, the U.S. should also consider pursuing a new high-standard digital and services trade deal with like-minded partners such as Australia, Japan, Singapore, the UK, and Costa Rica. Such a plurilateral agreement could provide an affirmative, rules-based counterpoint to China's mercantilist trade approach. Finally, we urge the administrations to secure the extension of the WTO moratorium on e-commerce duties and to positively re-engage in the WTO JSI e-commerce negotiations. We stand ready to support your efforts in ensuring American services and digital trade rank high among American negotiating priorities. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And I recognize Ms. Clausen for 5 minutes.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Sanchez, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I will address the importance of cooperation between the legislative and executive branches in an across-the-board trade agreement agenda. Trade agreements have long served important functions in our nation's history. From the earliest days, the United States has pursued treaties and other forms of agreements with its trading partners for multiple purposes. Trade agreements have been complements to other tools in the economic, regulatory, security, and foreign policy toolkits. Congress has had and continues to have a critical role in this exercise. Primarily, Congress tasks the executive branch with negotiating agreements and often approves those agreements that the executive seeks to enter. The cornerstone in that relationship has always been Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which provides that Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, and to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Given their political significance, large free trade agreements have occupied considerable time and attention, both among members of Congress and in the eyes of the public. These agreements, authorized and approved by Congress, are the most well-known of our trade agreements. The collaborative agreement-making process through which they are made is challenging, and it includes many points of compromise and engagement. But FTAs are not the only trade-related agreements into which the United States has entered. In recent decades, the executive branch agencies have concluded hundreds of trade-related agreements without clear congressional authorization or approval. I refer to these as trade executive agreements, given the lack of congressional involvement. Some colleagues also refer to them as skinny or mini deals, since they have been narrowly focused on one or a small set of trade issues, but they are not small in their impact. You'll be familiar with several of these from the last 8 years, such as the handful of deals concluded with Japan and a wide-ranging agreement with Taiwan. Those are just a sample. In total, the United States maintains trade agreements that fall short of comprehensive FTAs with 130 countries. Although trade executive agreements frequently serve meaningful ends in resolving trade problems for U.S. industries and other stakeholders, they are not without substantive and procedural costs. These sorts of agreements tend to circumvent regular rulemaking and the important guardrails set forth in legislation, including transparency, consultation, presentment, and approval requirements, as well as conditions on withdrawal. Publication and reporting are a further problem surrounding these agreements. What becomes apparent from these deals' attractive functions, as well as their costs, is that alternative trade agreements to FTAs are at least somewhat useful some of the time. So, space remains for trade deals concentrating on specialized topics and for bilateral agreements with specific countries. Not all trading partners may be able or willing to negotiate traditional comprehensive deals or deals with multiple countries, but smaller, more focused deals may be possible and indeed beneficial to the United States. The important work of this subcommittee can lay a solid foundation for the executive branch to undertake negotiations in these areas with oversight and input from Congress, so that future trade agreements are subject to appropriate scrutiny. Getting the balance right between the branches for different types of trade agreements will be important, not just as a constitutional matter, but also because such agreements will be more durable, ambitious, balanced, and legitimate than agreements entered into by the executive alone. There is an opportunity now to review and, where necessary, craft new legislation to ensure that future U.S. trade agreements are on strong footing, an initiative that will only make our nation even stronger. Thank you again for this opportunity to provide input into the work of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Ms. Clausen, and again, thank you to our entire panel for for sharing your perspective. We'll now go into the question and answer period where we can have a good exchange. I'll begin bringing up Australian beef, Mr. Kirkland. This is an issue I've been concerned now. Certainly, I represent a constituency that produces a lot of beef. Some would call it the top beef producing district in America, but we don't want to get too caught up in those details. But clearly, American beef leads the world in terms of quality and affordability. A lot of great qualities there. Unfortunately, some of our trading partners, many of them actually adopt significant tariff and non-tariff barriers. For example, for 20 years, Australian beef has enjoyed full access to the U.S. market. And while the Australian government imposes non-science-based restrictions on our beef, and could you provide more background on perhaps on these restrictions and perhaps reflect a little bit on Australia's measures as justified or not?
Thank you, Chairman. We might debate about who has the most cattle, but we won't today. So no, just all in kidding aside, no, I appreciate your question. And to give you that insight, so for the last 20 years, Australia has sold roughly $29 billion worth of beef to American consumers. In that same time, we have not exported and sold $1 worth of beef, fresh beef, in the country of Australia. That's a clear-cut differential. Australians have exhausted all their approval processes over the last 20 years, and we believe in science-based protocols, and we don't believe that there's any science-based protocols there. We fully believe that U.S. deserves full access to the Australian market.
Clearly an imbalance, and I appreciate that. Moving on to UK, Ms. Broadbent, I know that there's been a lot discussed about a potential trade agreement with the UK. There's some concern about the UK kind of reverting back to more EU-style regulations, certainly inconsistent with what I would say the voters of the UK ultimately decided on some time ago. But would you agree that the possibility exists that the UK might move closer to EU standards and perhaps the risk associated with that, perhaps whether it's agriculture or even digital?
Yeah, appreciate that. It is a big risk, I think, and I guess my point would be this is the time for us to negotiate with the UK because they're sort of sitting on a bit of a pivotal spot in the sense that Brexit happened 5 years ago. They've really wrestled with what the EU retained law is in the UK. There's been a lot of talk of a reset back with Brussels now that there's a new Labour government in the UK. And the EU will try to demand realignment so that the UK is basically implementing UK regulations. And that's not good for US interests. I think we have a chance here to work with the UK on some more constructive procedures on mutual recognition and just exchanging viewpoints on how we regulate, trying to find the least intrusive ways to do it. And I don't think Brussels regulation is really something that the UK should aspire to, and I think the US negotiators can make a great case for working together with the UK to be a little bit less than the heavy-handed nature of Brussels regulation.
Would you say there's some opportunities perhaps on leveling the playing field on agriculture?
Absolutely, because that's a huge break on our exports into both the UK and Europe, because the UK has a lot of legacy EU regulations, and particularly in beef and so forth. And so this would be one of the things the U.S. would be interested in, and it's a give and take in a negotiation. But I think we have a huge opportunity for making mutually advantageous concessions to each other on things.
Right. Well, I'm always eager to really reflect on modern agriculture here in the U.S. that produces quality and affordability, and that I would hope that our trading partners, especially our friendly trading partners, would want to take advantage of that as well. Shifting gears just a bit, Mr. Root, you talked a lot about a VAT, value-added tax. Our trading partners kind of, I would say, play games with that. They waive or refund the VAT on their own products for their own taxpayers or consumers. and yet when they ship stuff, or when they ship it to us, they waive the VAT, and yet they don't waive on anything we ship to them, whether it's your products or across our economy. And that certainly creates an unlevel playing field. I think you would agree with that. Can you elaborate more on how you see that? I know you listed a long list of various countries and these uneven approaches that they take, but can you give a little more commentary to that inequity?
Certainly. Thank you, Chairman Smith. So as we look at VAT, we do feel like the landscape is slightly uneven and slightly unequal in terms of the treatment of American products in many foreign markets. Obviously, VAT can be very large percentages. We demonstrated some of those examples in my opening comments. That certainly is something that we feel puts us as a U.S. manufacturer at a competitive disadvantage. When you look at the premium nature of the product that we produce, certainly adds a fair amount of cost from a consumer standpoint. And again, we think is a perfect example of an uneven playing field and something that we would like to see addressed.
And I might add with emphasis that so many countries do this, it really creates a broad, unlevel playing field, as we keep pointing to. So it's my hope that we can ultimately encourage our trading partners to take a different approach. So with that, I now recognize Ms. Sanchez for 5 minutes for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Clausen, last Congress, this committee passed bipartisan legislation that affirmed Congress's constitutional authority on trade and implemented a trade agreement with Taiwan. As my colleagues may recall, the Biden administration was not planning on sending the trade agreement with Taiwan to Congress for approval. Democrats and Republicans in both chambers, however, raised concerns with the administration's approach because it usurped congressional authority over trade. I hope my Republican colleagues will remember this if President Trump decides to sideline Congress by relying on executive authority to enter into trade agreements. Professor Clausen, in your written testimony, you noted that restoring an appropriate separation of powers between Congress and the executive branch on trade is important not just as a constitutional matter, but also because agreements that are passed by Congress are more durable, ambitious, balanced, and legitimate than agreements entered into by the executive branch alone. Could you please expand on that just a little bit?
Absolutely. First, an agreement approved by Congress is likely to enjoy higher levels of bipartisan support. So it's likely that a subsequent administration will encounter more resistance if it seeks to withdraw, for example. Similarly, because of its legislative implementation, a congressional executive agreement is also more likely to remain in force longer, providing greater certainty for businesses and for workers. Second, Congress sets a higher bar for outcomes because it is focused on addressing a diverse array of economic interests. One could see this in the USMCA negotiations, for example, in the final product, which included the strongest labor enforcement provisions to date in a trade agreement. Congress also has broader authorities, including, importantly, to make changes to U.S. laws, affording negotiators a broader range of carrots and sticks to obtain a better outcome for U.S. constituencies. Third, Congress collectively represents a wide range of interests and can monitor the domestic impact of agreements through constituent engagement. And last, trade agreements approved by Congress can enjoy more legitimacy because voters can express their views most directly to their congressional representatives. So working together, the branches can often achieve more than they can working alone.
Thank you very much for that answer. Ms. Bliss, in your written testimony, you noted that China did not meet its commitments to purchase U.S. services under the first Trump administration's Phase 1 agreement. The Phase 1 agreement called for China to purchase at least $12.8 billion additional services in the first year of implementation and $25.1 billion after that. However, U.S. services exports to China declined sharply after the agreement was signed, reaching an estimated 54% of the level mandated by the Phase 1 agreement. In addition to not meeting its commitments under Phase 1, China maintains numerous trade barriers to U.S. service exports. including for cloud services, financial services, insurance, telecommunications, and audiovisual services. Ms. Bliss, could you please elaborate on China's trade barriers to exports of U.S. audiovisual services, especially streaming of movies, shows, and music? Use your microphone, please.
Thank you, Congresswoman Sanchez. Yes, I absolutely would agree with you that China is very deficient in meeting its Phase 1 commitments. And with respect to audiovisual, what they have failed to do is to increase the number of movie releases that they're bound to do under the previous binding agreement. And also the percentage of revenue is supposed to increase as well. So I think from the standpoint of U.S. industry, it's critically important that we hold their feet to the fire on both issues. And I think previously we had viewed this as potentially low-hanging fruit. So it's a real shame. It's a missed opportunity. So I absolutely would agree with you that this is an important issue to address, along with the other myriad barriers. And if I can just mention, one of the things that we're particularly concerned about is the level of harassment that's going on of U.S. companies right now.
Okay, thank you. I have just a few seconds left, but in this time, I just wanted to point out that in Mr. Root's testimony, he talked about a 56% retaliatory tariff from the European Union and a 25% retaliatory tariff from Canada. I just want to point out that retaliatory tariffs are in response to tariffs that the U.S., or more specifically, President Trump, has imposed first. So it's a tit-for-tat battle that started with the U.S. picking the fight, and that's how trade wars get started. And I'm not exactly anxious to see our country in trade wars with Canada, Mexico, China, and the European Union. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Arrington for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman and the ranking member for organizing the hearing and the panelists for your time and counsel. I'm especially excited to have a fellow West Texan and ag producer from my part of this great country in Mr. Kirkland, who has impeccable educational credentials as a graduate of Texas Tech University. So I am more confident today than maybe at any other time that we'll solve some problems and see some opportunities for the United States. Thank you, Mr. Kirkland, for all you do to make West Texas great. And let's talk about making American trade great. It doesn't work when we have an average trade rate of 3.3% and the 20 largest economies, developed countries, who we compete with and trade with, have twice that rate. And when you look at agriculture, I think our average rate is around 5%, but the 20 largest economies have 3 times that rate. How are we supposed to accept the fact that there is such a thing as free trade without fair trade? We're simply attempting, and this president is attempting for the second time, because we lost a lot of the ground we made up in his first term, to reset those relationships such that we're playing by the same set of rules. Then everyone wins. Then consumers get to choose, and producers and manufacturers get to make that value proposition, and everybody's quality of life improves as a result. Do you see it any differently than that? I mean, we're both West Texans. I mean, it seems pretty straightforward. Doesn't mean there won't be some pain associated on the front end. There certainly was in the first Trump term. But as I recall, he was successful at bringing those trade partners to the table. And in fact, because of the actions and leadership that he demonstrated, the same posture he's taking today, we were able to negotiate trade deals with 5 countries that represent over 50% of our export markets. Now that's success in West Texas. I don't know about any other part of the country. What say you, Mr. Kirkland, my fellow Texas Tech Red Raider?
Well, thank you, and Reckham. So,
Sweet 16, baby.
yeah, that's right. Here we go.
Here we go.
Okay. But I do agree. We do appreciate what what President Trump did in his first term. He opened some doors. He opened doors in China where we hadn't traded for 20 years, possibly. And so he opened doors, and then, like I said, over the last 4 years, there has been just not as much aggression there, and so it's time to step up to the plate, in our opinion. You know, the deal is it needs to be science-based. It's got to be, you know, we know that there's going to be restrictions. We know that sometimes there's going to be retaliatory tariffs. We do understand that. I know us as a company and our family, we understand that in the agriculture business. And do we like it? No, not necessarily. But we do understand for our next generation that's coming up, our fourth generation of family farmers that are starting to come into our business today, we're going to have to go through a little bit of pain to get to the spot where that next round of trade and everything is prosperous for the next generation.
You know, I can't imagine the Texas Tech Red Raiders taking on the Arkansas Hogs and let the Arkansas Razorbacks shoot layups for their free throws or pick up the ball and run with it instead of dribbling. I mean, can you ever imagine watching a competition where there were two sets of rules? Now, we'd still beat them, no question, under any set of rules and circumstances. But anyway, it just seems to me that it's un-American to not fight for our manufacturers, producers, and workers to simply have an even playing field. And I imagine whether it's Ms. Sanchez's district or mine, we'll whip the competition every day and twice on Sunday. We have the best technology, the best operators and producers, the hardest workers. I mean, we've got the inherent advantages. So at any rate, I appreciate your contributions. How about a last word from my friend from West
Well,
Texas?
and so I agree 100%. We're not scared of competition, right? Competition makes things better. And so that's what we believe, and just like you said. And so we just want a fair playing field, and unless, you know, that way people can enjoy the great beef that we produce all across our country, Nebraska, Kansas, Texas, all across, and Iowa, you know, across the feeding country, because people in this world, we know, love American beef.
Amen. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Panetta for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sanchez. Gentlemen, ladies, thank you for being here today and for your time, your experience, and your wisdom for sharing it with us. I appreciate that. I want to especially highlight this second hearing, thank you, Mr. Chairman, in which we're actually discussing trade negotiation priorities and what I hope is laying the foundation for the United States to return to entering into free trade agreements. Mr. Kirkland, I agree with you. Show a little more aggression when it comes to entering into these agreements is something that needs to be done in order to reduce both tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. Now, as much as I appreciated the last administration's frameworks, they are nothing compared to agreements, which can open up new markets for our producers and manufacturers, establish enforcement mechanisms, and ensure that American goods are treated fairly. And we get to these agreements, though, through serious, difficult, and complicated negotiations. That's why you negotiate. Fortunately, what we've seen, especially politically, is that trade has become a four-letter word. And based on those politics, there's been a sharp decline in the negotiations that can lead to agreements, and also a decline in, obviously, the number of agreements, not just in the last 4 years, but in the last couple decades. Yes, the Biden administration not only didn't even enter into any agreements, it failed to take legitimate steps towards any agreement. The first Trump administration struck 1, USMCA, the Obama administration struck 3, and the Bush administration, 13 free trade agreements. 13 free trade agreements under the Bush administration. Now it appears we have, unfortunately, an administration that, although they've shown an interest for agreements, the only T word they're using is for tariffs. This inconsistent shoot now, aim later approach on tariffs tangibly undermines our ability to work with partners and expand trade. And small businesses are getting caught in the crosshairs. A perfect example is what happened to one of my small food distributors in my district simply because their shipment got stuck in traffic at the Mexican border. Their goods entered the U.S. only 16 minutes after President Trump's Mexico tariffs went into effect, And then 3 days before, there was an exemption for USMCA compliant goods. And now this small business is facing a $38,000 bill from CBP, something we're working to remedy. Tariffs on our closest partners also undermine faith in negotiations and poison the relationships that we need to advance trade agreements. Additionally, tariffs increase input costs and expose U.S. industry and producers to crippling retaliatory tariffs, as we've talked about, which can shut down markets that are vital to our economy. The administration's tariffs are also, I believe, and I think many of us should believe, are an overreach of executive power, and Congress must reassert its role in trade policy, both to mitigate these damaging tariffs and to affirmatively shape the trade agenda going forward. Again, I appreciate this hearing. We should be doing more of these hearings. We should be doing more negotiations, and yes, with the ultimate goal of entering more trade agreements, free trade agreements, and assuring that Congress's constitutional role is lived up to. Ms. Broadbent, one region that I've been outspoken about, especially with free trade agreements, is Central Asia, which is critical, I believe, to U.S. strategic interests based on many areas, including its capacity for rare earth minerals and its geography situated between Russia and China. There's this thing called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, though, that denies permanent normal trade relations to several Central Asian nations, including Kazakhstan, which is a WTO member in good standing and a strong partner for the United States in the region. Now, Jackson-Vanik was originally intended to prevent the Soviet Union from halting Jewish immigration. However, that's no longer applicable, it's antiquated, and we've even lifted Jackson-Vanik for Russia and other countries. In your view, Ms. Broadbent, in your view, would lifting Jackson-Vanik for Kazakhstan improve U.S. relationships in Central Asia? And also, how could deepening trade relations in Central Asia bring Central Asian nations closer to the United States as opposed to Russia or China?
Thank you, Mr. Panetta. I mean, I think it's that statute has a long-standing statute since, I think, 1974, and it achieved a lot of things during its life. I think probably it is a good time to relook at it. That region of the world has a lot of outreach going on from Russia and China, and these countries have been pretty vocal about wanting to expand trade with the U.S., and they've got minerals, they've got opportunities for our exporters, so it would be something good to look at, I think.
Thank you. I do have other questions. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to yield it back. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Miller for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Sanchez, and thank you all for being here today. This can be an exciting time for trade, and my colleagues and I in the Ways and Means Committee are ready to invigorate American manufacturing and engage with our international partners to get moving on trade negotiations again. I agree absolutely with Mr. Panetta about Jackson-Vanik and what we need to do in Central Asia, that particular area. So now I'll speak about the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is an essential strategic foothold to combat China's quest for global economic dominance. The economies of the Indo-Pacific are rapidly developing. The growing personal wealth of the citizens in the Indo-Pacific provides more export opportunities. The advances in the region's manufacturing sector enables us to diversify our supply chain away from China. Unfortunately, we are falling severely behind as China makes significant strides. While the United States has not concluded a single trade agreement with an Indo-Pacific partner in more than 10 years, China has concluded negotiations with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations to enhance their massive free trade area in October of 2024. This is why I reintroduced the U.S. trade leadership in the Indo-Pacific Act with several of my colleagues on this committee. This bill will make significant inroads to further our partnerships in the region. Mr. Root, as you are aware, our lack of engagement in the Indo-Pacific has left the door open for these nations to stifle bilateral trade by imposing significant trade barriers on American products. This includes remarkably steep tariffs on Harley-Davidson motorcycles. Could you speak to the importance of the Indo-Pacific as an export market, And what can Congress do to overcome these barriers that are currently in place?
Thank you, Congresswoman Miller. As we look, we certainly believe that Asia Pacific presents a significant opportunity over the midterm and the long term from a Harley-Davidson perspective. As we look, we recognize that there are unique trade pacts that are in place that certainly provide some benefit to those who manufacture within that region. Many of our competitor brands have plants in Thailand that certainly ensure low tariff access to those ASEAN markets. Many Asian nations' trade agreements allow exports from Thailand into those markets duty-free, and that does provide certainly a significant advantage for them and a disadvantage for direct exports from the U.S. into those markets. We obviously do ask for, again, a level playing field that gives American workers the ability to export their products with equal treatment.
Thank you. And as we engage in these important trade negotiations, it's important that we work to strengthen the emergent sectors of our economy, particularly in the digital services economy. President Trump and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle are keenly aware of the unfair treatment the United States technology companies are facing by even our closest allies, including Canada and South Korea. It's pertinent that we put a stop to this and to ensure that our future agreements adequately protect U.S. companies from harmful policies. Ms. Bliss, what provisions should we include in our future trade agreements to make sure that our digital and service companies are adequately shielded from unfair treatment?
Thank you, Congresswoman Miller. I agree with you. It's a very, very serious problem. And I think, first and foremost, data flows underpin all digital and services, virtually all services trade. So I would say that that is one very key element we need to see in all of our trade agreements. Secondly, we need to see a prohibition on data localization, which often is coupled with restrictions on data flows. And third, and perhaps most importantly, we need to see a strong non-discrimination provision, which really goes to the core of your question. And whether you're looking at India in the case of the Indo-Pacific, or you're looking at Korea, one of our closest allies, I think having a strong non-discrimination provision is absolutely essential that we include in our agreements. And particularly in Korea, where we're facing legislative proposals, regulatory proposals for discriminatory online platform regulation. I think it's essential that that happen there, and also that we're frankly facing, both in Korea and China, harassment of U.S. firms through regulatory and unfair regulatory and enforcement actions. So I would say those three provisions are probably very, very key in terms of negotiating and resolving those issues.
Thank you so much. We've used up our time. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Delbene for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for being with us today. As I said during our last trade hearing, Republicans on this committee need to speak up and work with us to support Congress's authority on trade and taxes. Right now, President Trump is attempting to impose the largest tax increase in over 30 years on the American people through various tariff hikes, which consumers ultimately pay for without a vote in Congress. In fact, Republicans snuck a hidden provision into the vote schedule 2 weeks ago that effectively surrendered Congress's role in setting taxes and tariffs on the American people to Trump. And this made it so House Republicans didn't have to vote directly on whether to keep Trump's tariffs on Canada and Mexico in place. And he was only able to impose these tariffs by trying to declare national emergencies, including against Canada for its role in the fentanyl crisis, even though we know that fentanyl from our northern border accounts for only 0.2% of total seizures by the Border Patrol. And this also happened the same day that Trump levied huge new tariffs on steel and aluminum on countries including our closest allies like Canada, which are already driving up the cost of building cars, planes, and new homes. And let's talk a little bit more about Canada for a second. I have a question for any of my Republican colleagues, some of who I've worked with closely over the past decade. Do you think it's okay that Trump and some of your colleagues disrespect and belittle Canadians by calling their leader a governor and referring to their country as the 51st state? Do you think it's a joke? My constituent is in Washington certainly don't think it's funny. And right now, Trump is turning our allies into enemies. Canadians are boycotting American products at grocery stores and retail stores, and according to the latest federal figures, 500,000 fewer Canadians crossed the land border into the United States in February compared to last year. In fact, that's the lowest it's been since COVID-era testing and quarantine rules were in place. And many Canadians don't want to fly here either. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record an article published in The Hill, which highlights that Canadian airlines are canceling flights to Tennessee and reducing flights to Arizona, Florida, and Las Vegas.
Without objection, so ordered.
This is already having a big negative impact on Canadian tourism, which generates over $20 billion and supports over 100,000 jobs across the United States. And what's the goal? Trump's tariffs plan are full of holes. He says they're a negotiating tactic, but what are we trying to negotiate? Whatever Trump thinks is unfair. None of our allies have clarity. Americans don't have clarity. And if the tariffs are for negotiating leverage, then they won't end up raising any revenue when he removes them. But the Republican plan is to pay for extending trillions of dollars in tax cuts by raising revenue with tariffs. So Republicans want to pass big tax cuts, which mostly benefit the wealthy, pay for a small portion of those tax cuts by gutting health care and food support for low-income people who use Medicaid and SNAP, and then balloon our already $36 trillion deficit because the supposed tariffs won't actually be in place for enough time to raise any revenue. Or if the tariffs are permanent, then all Americans are forced to pay higher prices on goods, and the retaliation against our businesses and farmers becomes even more devastating. These are concerns that should be bipartisan and could be worked through if we had a deliberative process that involved Congress. And Ms. Clausen, do you agree that the Constitution gives Congress, not the executive branch, the power to regulate foreign commerce and impose taxes and tariffs?
Yes.
Thank you. So Washington State's economy is extremely reliant on trade and selling our products to customers around the world. So I want to see the United States get back in negotiating real trade agreements that go through Congress. But at the same time, I'm concerned about giving even more power to a president at a time when he is abusing the current limited authorities that Congress has given him. And I also wonder what the point of entering into trade agreements is, like we did with bipartisan USMCA, if Trump can blow up the deal by imposing sweeping tariffs on Canada and Mexico. So, Ms. Clausen, I wondered what guardrails can Congress put into future trade promotion authority or trade deal implementation laws to ensure that a president can't effectively destroy trade deals by imposing tariffs without the consent of Congress?
Very briefly, thank you, Congresswoman. There are a number of approaches that the subcommittee could consider. I would submit that it may wish to consider both existing authorities as well as future authorities and the ways they interact. Interestingly, Trade Promotion Authority evolved since 1974 in a way that Congress added more procedural protections, more oversight, while Congress didn't take the same approach in the tariff-raising delegations. So taking a look at them together makes good sense, I think, to ensure productive, cooperative, coherent trade policy. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Smucker for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Thank you to the witnesses for sharing your testimony today. I think one of the highlights and one of the lasting impacts of Trump's first term were his efforts to rebalance global trade. While the United States has historically been very generous in letting foreign products into our markets, American producers have not always received the same similar treatment in other countries. Instead, U.S. products have faced exorbitant tariff rates and unfair discrimination, sometimes by even some of our closest allies. And as I said, in his first term, President Trump conducted trade negotiations that meaningfully opened foreign markets and resulted in real successes. such as the USMCA, the U.S.-Japan trade agreement, and others. And through the America First Trade Policy Presidential Memorandum, the President has communicated that he intends to do the same during the next 4 years. And I would say that Republicans on the Ways and Means Committee stand ready to work with President Trump to shape these new trade agreements, ensuring that American products, workers, and industries are treated fairly around the world. In fact, Congress plays an important role in ensuring that American manufacturers aren't targeted in global trade disputes, as we've seen all too often with Harley-Davidson, for example. And I'm very pleased to have you with us here today, Mr. Root. Harley has a significant presence in York, Pennsylvania, which is one of the counties that I represent in my district. You have 1,300 employees working there. I've been to the plant several times. 3 assembly lines, friends of mine who work there, and they're crafting 33 different models of motorcycles, and we appreciate the commitment to our region and the job creation there. And as you outlined in your testimony, as an iconic American company, Harley-Davidson motorcycles are often targeted by foreign tariff regimes, so-called luxury taxes and other non-tariff barriers. So, Mr. Root, if you had a magic wand, what policy solutions, what trade measures would you recommend, or would you implement, or would recommend that Congress pursue to help level the playing field for Harley-Davidson and for other U.S. exporters in foreign markets?
Thank you, Congressman Smucker. As we look, we certainly believe that any trade agreement must have enforcements and reciprocal duties, minimize non-tariff barriers, things like excise taxes, luxury taxes that we've talked about, and enforce country of origin requirements. We certainly aren't asking for protectionism, but rather fairness.
Thank you. Can you outline some of the most significant tariff barriers that you face in key markets like the EU and in India?
Certainly.
Maybe also how that affects your bottom line and how that affects your operations.
Certainly. So some of the things that we've talked about are very high tariff treatment in select markets in terms of products that we export from the U.S. That includes the 100% tariff we talked about in India. It includes the 6%, which could go to 56% from an EU perspective. We talked about the situation in Denmark and some of the luxury taxes that get passed along. So many elements for us to think about. In addition, there are a number of non-tariff barriers that countries place on our products. These include special licensing requirements for certain size motorcycles. So there are a number of very obvious ways that we feel we are certainly targeted, and then there are some elements that are a bit more creative.
Well, as a member of the U.S.-UK interparliamentary group, there's so much that we could do to be working together and improve our economic partnership. And I hope that we get to that with the Trump administration. Certainly, we didn't see that with the Biden administration. And so we're hopeful that we see those kind of negotiations take place. Manufacturing is one of the top industries in my district, most of it focused on agriculture, which is also a top industry. And although it may not be top of mind, digital trade is integral to this type of production, with traditional industries like manufacturing receiving 75% of the value added by data flows. Ms. Bliss, can you explain how digital trade rules in trade agreements enhance manufacturing and enable us to make more things in America?
Your microphone isn't on,
Thank
but
you.
the time is limited.
Thank you for that question. Just very quickly, it's absolutely essential because, as in the case of most sectors in the economy, they increasingly are digitized. And what that means is a combination of services and digital technologies. So for manufacturing, it's everything from design and research at the front end to robotics on the factory floor and big data flows and analysis, to insertion of chips in the equipment itself to ensure its safety and operation, to after sales and service, transportation, financing.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And now we will go, as is typical, a 2-to-1. And so I'll now recognize Mr. Murphy, and then Mr. Duggan will be recognized after that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for the witnesses for coming today. We're obviously in different times when it comes to trade in our country. Sadly enough, I think the Band-Aid, fortunately, rather, has been ripped off of what have been predatory practices from some of our partners, but a lot of our adversaries. Unfortunately, little progress, if any, was made during the last administration. We would have meetings in here, and literally nothing was being done. Thankfully, we have a president in new office who understands the trade barriers that this nation has faced, both from countries like India, from China, and even from our friends in Europe. North Carolina's 3rd Congressional District, which I am blessed to represent, is a host to a variety of industries that are affected by trade. First, I'll talk about the agricultural trade. North Carolina, 3rd, is the 4th largest hog district. We used to be the 2nd. I wonder what happened. I think Randy Feenstra took off a little bit, but that's a little mutt. But, you know, we have thousands of jobs in Eastern North Carolina in the hog industry, billions of dollars in economic industry. However, things that have happened to the hog industry, Prop 12, which was pushed by California, which I don't understand why it was allowed to stand, is almost like a non-tariff trade barrier that's affected American industries, and American poultry, trying to push off some arbitrary phytosanitary regulations. So on a different note, with my colleague Randy Feenstra, I called on the U.S. Trade Rep last session to take action on South Africa's trade barriers that were unfairly blocking American pork. South Africa is just one of the many countries that unfairly targets the American pork producer. In the first Trump administration, we saw USTR revoke eligibility of GSP products from Thailand as a result from their unfair trade practices against the American pork. Same thing with South Asia, Vietnam. We want greater access. Mr. Kirkland, can you discuss how we best, given the world of agriculture, how we can better serve our farmers and our agricultural producers by negotiating trade agreements that address both tariff and non-tariff issues? Our farmers are hurting right now. We need access to a lot of other markets.
Yeah, thank you. And that's correct. Like you mentioned, and you know, I know you represent a lot of the hog industry. I can't speak to it directly, but within the beef industry, I can talk with is all agriculture related. So again, 50% tariff in Thailand, 30% in Vietnam, 10% in Philippines, 5% Indonesia. Those tariffs that are we know that they're there for protectionists. We know that they're there to keep our beef out of their country. You know, we feel like there needs to be a free playing ground. There needs to be competition. We need to open those markets, and it's going to become, you know, I can't tell you exactly how it needs to be done, but I believe there needs to be new agreements. And like I said, sometimes there's tariffs that go along with it, but that what I believe is there needs to be new agreements established and try to, you know, engage in those. Ultimately, China is about a $2 billion market for the beef industry, and you know, we don't want to completely. They've shut us off. Currently, we're not exporting any beef to China, and so.
I wish America just knew all this, which they don't. I mean, people are busy in their lives. They don't understand how we've been mistreated by the rest of the world. So,
yeah, so
let me move on to that question. I appreciate it. You know, Mr. Root, I won't make you repeat this, but Harley-Davidson is facing the same things that so much of our boat industry in Eastern North Carolina is facing, as far as challenges with getting out exports overseas. One thing I would like to talk a little bit about is just the medical supply chain. I want to ask, I don't want to expend my time, but we have a stranglehold. China has a stranglehold on us with products from medical supplies that are crucial to this country. I wonder, Ms. Broadbent, can you address how we can better secure our medical supply chains through trade negotiations? You know, we need to onshore, we need to nearshore, but how can we do this better through trade?
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. Yeah, I think it's an important area which we have to look at closely. There is the Secure Medical Supply Chain Act, I think that you maybe sponsored, and it sets up a structure where we negotiate with countries so we have a sense of what kind of secure supply we would have with them, and you call them, I think it's the trusted trade partner, and you would have a special relationship. You would look at regulations, you'd look at sourcing, you'd look at possibilities for nearshoring, onshoring. But to sit down with countries that you could trust and work out how you could better guarantee to each other that you would have secure supply in a pandemic situation or some other crisis.
I think we've missed a great opportunity in the last 4 years with doing Central America as trying to nearshore. It's a population that needs business. It keeps people at home, and it was a great deficit that, we're talking about root causes of migration. This is the #1 one. So
agree.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Doggett is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the hearing and the testimony of our witnesses who offer insights on a number of long-range problems. But I'm amazed that we could be here at this point and not hear a word from our Republican colleagues or any of the witnesses they've summoned about Liberation Day. We're only a week away from Liberation Day, the day that President Trump has told us will be liberated in the trade area, and it would seem that while these long-range problems are important, that we would hear some justification, some celebration, or explanation of what this next important step in President Trump's trade war means and how it will liberate us. Of course, Liberation Day, in the true spirit of George Orwell, means just the opposite of the name, as it was indicated when the spokeswoman for President Trump recently actually said from the White House podium that tariffs are a tax cut, to the amazement of all. Well, tariff may be the most beautiful word in the dictionary to President Trump, but his incompetent implementation of his trade policy is already hiking the prices that my constituents and yours are paying. We know from the recent meeting of the Federal Reserve Board that we're probably already paying higher interest rates for anyone who's buying a car, a house, or business inventory because interest rates are being kept higher with the uncertainties of the Trump Liberation Day. And the House Republican answer to all this, of course, is to wash their hands of any involvement and to surrender all of Congress's authority to the president and to write into law that Congress can do nothing about the outrage that's about to occur. Now, last week, I talked to the representative, a senior representative of a foreign country that respectfully approached this month the Trump administration to ask a simple question. What can our country do to avoid these big tariff increases on the goods and services that we export to the United States? Is there anything we can do? And they got a clear answer from the Trump administration and a high official there. And the answer was, there's absolutely nothing you can do because President Trump is intent on imposing tariffs on almost every country in the world. They did get one important piece of guidance, and that was, don't complain about it, because if you complain about it, it will upset President Trump, and he'll just spike the tariffs even higher in his trade war. And we've certainly heard President Trump make contradictions great again by attacking our most valued trading allies, our allies in the world for democracy and freedom, and playing nice with war criminals and thugs. His is not just a tariff policy or a trade war. It is a terrible policy. It is part of an unnecessary trade war with Liberation Day that won't liberate us, but will liberate dollars from our pocketbooks as we have to pay more for foreign goods. This means a cost for virtually every American consumer. Less well understood is the direct relation between this trade war and the 2017 Trump tax scam, which Republicans are so eager to impose on us again. That was a policy that rewarded companies for moving their factories abroad. And one of the industries that took the Republicans up on this and the Trump tax scam and did it so well, as always, is the pharmaceutical industry. They were so eager to exploit the new corporate tax giveaways that they moved offshore production, particularly to Ireland. Prior to the 2017 Trump tax scam, we annually imported about $65 billion worth of drugs each year from Europe. Now we have $155 billion, about a $90 billion per year gain. And what is the overall trade balance or trade deficit in drugs with Europe? Well, it's a deficit of about $100 billion per year, almost the same size as the $90 billion increase in the imported drugs from the Trump tax scam. And the result, of course, is that pharma in last year paid absolutely nothing in taxes and sought some tax refunds, despite charging American consumers the highest prices in the world. So my Texas constituents look forward to Liberation Day, knowing that they'll be paying more for goods in a war we cannot win. American agriculture faces retaliatory measures, just like during the first term when we had unjustified pain for agriculture. I think we will see liberation perhaps for Big Pharma, but only pain for American consumers. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I just want to say thank you so much to all of you for being here. I represent New York's 24th Congressional District. It's an honor to represent that area. This was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution along the Erie Canal Corridor. I represent basically the shoreline of Lake Ontario all the way from the St. Lawrence Seaway westward to the Niagara River. So much of, and for decades, I should say, for even more than many decades, U.S. trade policy has allowed other countries to take advantage of our American farmers, our workers, our businesses all along this corridor with great repercussions. It's hollowed out my region. There are empty buildings, empty facilities, factories all across the region, but some still do remain. And under President Trump, during his first term, America finally got back to fight against some of these horrendous policies that allowed foreign countries and foreign companies to take advantage of us. And now, because of those efforts, we've been able to lower some of the costs and able to bring some of our markets back here, including repatriating a lot of money, repatriating a lot of our resources. So I believe that any of these current trade deals that we're dealing with today under President Trump need to give us expanded access, especially for my district, which, by the way, is the 5th largest dairy district in the entire country, and it is the largest agricultural district in the Northeast. So expanding through the trade policy our access to foreign markets, which some of my colleagues have referenced, has been cut off for dairy, for example, for apples, for obviously the beef. We talked about beef earlier. So I applaud President Trump's efforts, especially in the first term, of trying to get China to purchase some of our agricultural products and continuing to try to make that happen and to make market access a priority in when we craft these deals. Unfortunately, many of these deals have not put America first, and I think attempting to do that by bringing the balance of trade back to the United States and giving us an opportunity to have our goods and sold, our agricultural goods of all kinds sold on the open market are important. So my first question is going to be to Mr. Kirkland. And many of these policymakers argue that the trade deals haven't benefited rural America. You described in your testimony that the beef industry relies on exports. From your perspective, and I know you've touched on this, what should U.S. trade negotiators keep in mind when they put the deals together? And what do you think about the concept of universal tariffs or universal trade?
Okay, thank you. And I agree with you when you talk about balanced trade. I agree 100%. And so some countries have identified the United States agriculture as a target for retaliation. We've seen that. That's not ideal for farmers and ranchers, but it's also bad for global consumers. So those consumers that are buying our goods as well. However, tariffs can be an effective tool. We've seen that. We've seen it resolve serious problems and massive trade barriers. And we'll work with Congress and the President to accomplish those goals. And so we understand those things. We understand there may be some headwinds, but we're there ready to dig in and get after it.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Mr. Root, I discussed with your CEO last year. Long been a fan of Harley-Davidson. I own a Harley-Davidson. I have a Softail Deluxe, which I love. I've test-driven just about every other one, but I keep staying with the same one. Just, it's an amazing opportunity. I love how you described it. You know, it's got a great reputation, and people around the world do want to drive Harley-Davidsons. I was kind of stunned at the numbers you put out on the import penalties, trades, VATs, everything, just to prevent Harley-Davidsons from being sold around the world. In fact, I have some European friends who come to the United States just so they can take a Harley-Davidson across the United States. But I just talked about this briefly with Mr. Kirkland, and I'm just wondering you outlined some of the things we could do, but what do you think we can do with the universal baseline tariff in terms of dealing with, is it a universal baseline tariff? Do we need reciprocal trade, free trade agreements? How do we make it fair? And a lot of, obviously there are a lot of Europeans and people around the world, as you say, in Thailand and other places that want to drive a Harley-Davidson. It's a unique ride. How do we do that, and what do you recommend is the best way to do that?
Congresswoman Tenney, thank you for your support of Harley-Davidson. Thank you for enjoying riding your Softail Deluxe. As we certainly look at trade, we believe that the best thing is fair trade. From our perspective, as we think about what that means, that would mean that we are enjoying treatment moving into a country equivalent to what other countries enjoy when they bring products into the U.S. We talked through the fact that tariffs in terms of motorcycles being imported into the U.S. have a 0 to 2.4% import tariff. We would ask for reciprocity.
Thank you very much. I'm out of time, but I really appreciate all the witnesses. Sorry I didn't get to everyone. I now recognize Ms. Van Dyne for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for our witnesses for being here today. As we work with the Trump administration to conduct a comprehensive review of America's trade policy, we must ensure that our trade engagements put America workers and farmers, manufacturers, and energy producers first. For far too long, our competitors, and especially our adversaries, have taken advantage of U.S. markets while our businesses face unfair barriers abroad. We've heard it all across the country. The days of passive trade policy are over, and I am committed to working with the Trump administration to expand market access and to ensure that American farmers and small businesses get access to markets and opportunities they deserve. And that being said, securing new market access is only part of the equation. And I'm continuing to emphasize that we must also hold our trade partners accountable. Mexico and Canada must stand with us in confronting China's unfair trade practices, particularly the flooding of subsidized goods into our markets. And as we approach the USMCA review, we must ensure that we are fully enforcing their commitments to not allow China to exploit loopholes at our expense. We know trade agreements are only as good as their enforcement, and Mexico and Canada must be full partners in preventing Beijing from exploiting North America as a backdoor into U.S. markets. The USMCA was a hard-fought win for American workers, but we cannot allow China to circumvent tariffs and restrictions by shipping goods through our neighbors. We need strict enforcement measures to prevent this type of manipulation and ensure that Mexico and Canada fully uphold their obligations under their agreement. Additionally, Mexico must return the land of Vulcan materials that is wrongfully expropriated and commit to upholding its part of the Mexican water treaty that is especially important in Texas. China remains the greatest long-term threat to fair trade and American economic security. And as we consider new trade agreements this Congress, we will address China's market manipulation, dumping of steel and aluminum, forced technology transfers, and IP theft to protect American economic interests both home and abroad. Trade must be free, but also fair and fully enforced. We must secure better trade deals, hold bad actors accountable, and protect American industries from unfair competition. Mr. Kirkland, I know that Congresswoman Tenney had asked you a similar question, but I don't know that I got the answer that I was looking for specifically. In your testimony that you had discussed interest in expanding trade in Southeast Asia, specifically in Vietnam and in Thailand. Can you help explain how these trade agreements with these two countries would benefit U.S. cattle producers?
Yes, thank you. And I kind of talked about the trade with China, and that's what you were talking about. Is our reliance, or not really reliance, but our heavy trade with China is being a $2 billion market for the beef industry, with the large tariffs from Vietnam and Thailand. We appreciate everything that the Trump administration did in his first term to get China open, but at the end of the day, We've got Australia, New Zealand, and Canada that have 0 tariffs for all these countries that we have tariffs against, that have tariffs against us. And so we don't need to depend on China to be our main source of beef exports. That's in my opinion. We need non-science-based restrictions and basically a competitive trade platform that we can stand on and continue to move our product to those other countries in the South Asia area.
Thank you. Ms. Broadman, you have a lot of experience in this. Can you talk about how we can improve our trade deals with countries like Mexico that have posed challenges in the past and have basically completely ignored many of the regulations they agreed to under the USMCA?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the review of the USMCA agreement that's coming up, the committee's starting to think about it now, and I think we just have to...
I can't hear you.
Pay very close attention to the letter and the law of the agreement. And
are there things that you think that we could put into it to make it stronger that would actually give it teeth?
I guess I would assume there are. I can't think of what exactly you want right now. I mean, is it a dispute settlement enforcement or
ways that we've seen them abuse it in the last 4 years?
Sorry?
We've seen them abuse it in the last 4 years.
Yeah. No,
are
I
there things that we
understand
could have
that,
included in the USMCA that we should look at in the review that
Right.
would actually make that enforcement easier?
I mean, I think Mexico and the U.S. are engaged in pretty tough talks right now, given the threats of the tariffs and so forth. And I think let's wait and see how that plays out and use the review to look at rules of origin and agreements that we can, areas where we can improve the agreement, because we know where the problems are now that we didn't know when it was implemented.
That's excellent. Thank you, and I yield back.
Representative Byer is recognized.
Chairman Murphy, thank you very much, and thank all of you for hanging with us this afternoon. We're having this hearing a week before what Donald Trump has taken to calling Liberation Day, and frankly, that adds a bit of absurdity to this exercise. We're discussing new no-slow trade agreements while the president is busy tearing up the last one he negotiated. You know, I'm very interested in the possibilities of free trade agreements with the United Kingdom, with Switzerland, but it's hard to imagine an FTA in the present context. On April 2nd, the president has promised to alleviate tariffs in some form and some amount, based on some invented but yet to be revealed metrics on an unknown list of countries relying on dubious authority. We're told that these tariffs will remedy all manner of slights, real or imagined. Countries around the world and businesses around the country are scrambling to understand the MAGA astrology that these supposedly reciprocal tariffs will be based. Investment is on pause, your 401k is down, and uncertainty is up. This opacity might be less dangerous if the president wasn't simultaneously promoting his crypto token, a historic platform for industrialized bribery. And then depending on what you want to buy, your paycheck won't stretch as far because Howard Lutnick has felt disrespected by some prime minister somewhere. Your life will be more expensive to protect the president's feelings. Does that feel like liberation to you? In the past 2 months, on and off trade war against Canada have given us the perfect distillation of the emptiness and absurdity of the administration's trade policy. The Wall Street Journal called it the dumbest trade war in history. When they're right, they're right. We've heard 17 different pretexts for the necessity of aggressive tariffs that will raise costs, destroy integrated supply chains, and turn friends into enemies. The only one the president will stick to is his desire to turn a proud and friendly nation of 40 million people who can't stand him into the 51st state. You won't hear a lot of that from my Republican friends because they know how utterly stupid that sounds. And you won't sound any smarter explaining to your constituents that the price of medicine just went up because Denmark refused to sell us Greenland for Trump coins. Are there irritants in the U.S.-Canada trade relationship? Sure. But this is blowing off your toe to cure a hangnail. It's burning our manufacturing base in order to save it. And this has been so successful, the president now wants to do a world tour with American consumers footing the bill. This committee should be leading the charge to reassert congressional trade authority. We should be working together to protect the economy from an ideological and emotional tariff program that will make us poorer and kill more jobs than it saves. Dr. Clausen, it seems to me the objective of the America First trade agenda are at cross purposes. Nowhere is this more glaring than the emphasis on tariffs as a revenue source, at the same time using tariffs to secure market access abroad. In your view, would replacing our current tax base with significant tariffs constrain the ability of our trade negotiators to make deals lest they blow a hole in the deficit?
Thank you, Congressman. I would say in response to that, you've highlighted how the delegations are extremely expansive. And most of these three-digit statutes, as we call them, they have these, go by these three-digit numbers. They come from a time of, they were negotiated, they were completed during the Cold War and reflected the state of play of the global economy at that time. So I think it makes sense, as you've suggested, that Congress would want to reevaluate that trade toolkit 50 years on, given the current circumstances, just as it has done on many occasions before now.
Dr. Clausen, various administration officials seem to have a conception of reciprocal tariffs that would include the national value-added taxes, the VATs, even though these taxes apply to domestic goods and services as well as imports, and in many countries are the largest component of the tax base. Does this make sense to you?
I can't speak to that directly at this time, Representative, but I would leave it to our economist expert to guide us through that policy analysis.
Okay. Ms. Bliss, I've had lots of meetings with service exporters who've raised all sorts of trade irritants in countries where they do business, but I can't recall them ever citing a VAT as somehow discriminatory against American companies. Is this something that you've been hearing from your membership?
Thank you, Congressman Beyer. In specific context, yes. And the context I will mention is Mexico. And there's a very serious concern that Mexico is making an interpretation of its VAT that would impose retroactively back to 2014 VAT taxes on insurance companies. And that is a real serious concern. So I would say conceptually, the notion of a VAT, no, if it's non-discriminatory. However, depending on how it's administered, and I would use Mexico as an egregious example, that is a problem. Also, with respect to Europe, there is concern about how the VAT is imposed and whether it's imposed on a level playing field. So again, I would say conceptually a VAT in and of itself may not be a bad thing. It depends on how it's administered, and I would say Mexico is the most urgent issue we need to deal with.
Great, thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Moore for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Kirkland, President Trump has indicated his interest in making a trade deal with the United Kingdom, which poses a unique opportunity for the Utah beef and cattle industry. Utah exported nearly $86 million of beef in 2022, and 79% of our 17,000 plus farms and ranches are owned by individuals or single families. My question is this. We know that British consumers love beef, but the U.S. beef is highly restricted due to quota rates and tariffs, which are largely left over from their days in the European Union. I'm also aware the U.S. and U.K. made it through 5 rounds of negotiations on a trade deal in early 2020 during Trump's first administration, but that agriculture was never addressed due to the sensitivity of the issue. I get that it might continually be a sensitive issue, but what opportunities do you see for U.S. beef exports in a trade agreement with the U.K.?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. Yeah, and so I would say, I mean, British consumers, we've seen they love U.S. beef. It's high, and it is highly restrictive due to small quotas and tariffs. So we see, I see very similar as you do, that we see that there's opportunity there. With the change of UK leaving the EU, that there are going to be opportunities. There are barriers already in place now. What we believe is we have to push for science-based trade. I mean, at the end of the day, that's the barrier. It's non-tariff barriers that are non-science-based. We believe they need to be science-based, and that we believe there's a great opportunity there for extended trade and new deals with the UK.
Absolutely. Our two countries actually share many values and standards when it comes to raising cattle, and I'm hopeful, because this is a difficult topic. The whole concept of tariffs and the current trade situation. It's not easy for anybody, particularly us on the trade committee, on the trade subcommittee. But we do need points of leverage. We do need points of negotiation to be able to take place, or we will get taken advantage of. This in our agriculture industry needs this. I mean, this is the fundamental problem with USMCA. So many positives, but Canada, with respect to dairy, has not lived up to their end of the bargain. And so we need to be able to go through this difficult time. It's tough and will continue to be very difficult, but we've got to be able to find opportunities like this. Thank you, Mr. Kirkland. Mr. Root, one of the things that I'm hearing from Utah businesses over and over again is that trade is not just about tariffs and revenue margins. It's also a tool that we can rejuvenate U.S. manufacturing and encourage companies to reshore their businesses to the United States. In the long run, it's going to be impossible for American companies to come back if they don't have good access to the intermediate products and inputs that they need to make things domestically. My question is simple. How can U.S. trade negotiations support reshoring efforts and ensure American manufacturers remain globally competitive? Any rules in particular that we need to be writing to be able to enforce this?
Thank you, Congressman Moore. So as we've talked about, we actually believe that fair trade revolves around a policy in which there is a fair and equal tariff rather than an imbalance in tariffs. We believe that Harley-Davidson has actually highlighted that you can produce in the U.S. and you can source from the U.S. As we go through and we take a look, 95% of what we sell in the U.S. is produced in the United States. We do that with a very, very heavy sourcing within the United States for our parts and components, with 70 to 80% of what we actually put into our motorcycles produced from within the United States. So from our perspective, in order to answer your question, we do believe that it really is a matter of fairness in tariffs and ensuring that we're not in a position where people who bring products into the U.S. or export to the U.S. have a policy where they actually have 0 to 2.4% tariffs, whereas we end up paying significantly higher levels than that outside of the U.S.
Thank you. Ms. Broadbent, I won't be able to get into the broad implications of U.S.-Taiwan exports. I should have never left 30 seconds for that. But thank you for your work on understanding of this. There is some positives moving forward with Taiwan, but they face, an enormous amount of potential coercion from in the South China Sea and their neighbors there, and we've got to be able to navigate this in a positive way. So, with that, I won't ask any questions on that, and thank you for your work, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Stubbe for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After 4 years of weakness and absence, it is great to know that America is back on the world stage. President Trump is enacting a robust trade agenda, one that actually advances the interests of our country. We cannot allow other countries to undermine our domestic industries, or our allies are on notice that we will not let them rip us off or discriminate against American products. Mr. Kirkland, I'll start with you. I know that one of the biggest priorities for U.S. cattle producers is holding Brazil and Paraguay accountable. These are countries with a history of foot and mouth disease, and they were granted beef access to the U.S. under highly questionable conditions. We need the administration to hold them accountable and protect the safety of U.S. consumers and the U.S. cattle herd. Brazil and Paraguay were recently given access to the U.S. market despite strong opposition from U.S. cattle producers. Should we trust beef imports from Brazil and Paraguay and other countries with a history of foot and mouth disease?
Thank you, Congressman Stubbe. And so I'll just start by saying, I've talked about competition throughout the day, and this is not about competition, what we're talking about here. This is about safety for our herd and safety for our consumers. And so we know that Brazil and Paraguay have had outbreaks of foot and mouth disease, and it's dangerous for the animal disease and would be devastating to our livestock herd in the United States. So if you kind of go back in both instances, USDA Secretary Vilsack denied our request to suspend access and conduct new audits on Brazil and Paraguay to confirm their claims. So basically, we've got to go back and set back where we've been, and we've got to go back and do audits and look and see where we're at there and stop suspend access to Brazil and Paraguay into our markets today. So I think it's every sector of the beef industry agrees.
Thank you. Ms. Broadbent, President Trump has discussed the need for improved bilateral relationships with the United Kingdom, and their prime minister seems like one of the few sensible world leaders working with the president. Can you provide more details on how a U.S.-UK trade agreement could improve bilateral regulatory cooperation?
Thank you, Mr. Stubbe, for that question. Yeah, I think it's a huge opportunity to kind of tack the UK back a bit from Brussels' heavy-handed type of regulation, which is not science-based, not mutual recognition, and Brussels seeks to harmonize everybody with Brussels regulations. So to sell in Europe, they demand that you follow their regulations to the law rather than having your own standards that they could recognize. And I think the UK would be a good partner to talk to about this. We spent a long time negotiating with Europe under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TTIP negotiations, and never came to any result that would open markets for U.S. exports of beef there. So we need to try it with the UK. It may be a sensitive issue in the UK, but I think we've got smart people that can figure out regulations so that we both feel assured with the safety of the food that we're getting.
Which sectors do you believe would benefit the most from that type of collaboration?
I think all sectors, manufacturing, services, and agriculture, because it's an overall approach to regulation that goes across the economy that the UK took on board when they joined the European community. So to the extent that they can relook at some of these regulations and with an eye towards increasing access for U.S. exports, I think it's very valuable, and it will be valuable for them because it will have less of the Brussels stamp on it.
Ms. Bliss, you advocate for using the USMCA's digital and financial services disciplines as a model for future agreements. What specific elements of USMCA do you believe are most essential to replicate and improve upon when negotiating with other nations?
And I would use the term building block because I think there are other things that can be added, but I think primarily the cross-border data flows, data localization prohibition, non-discriminatory treatment of digital content, the cybersecurity provisions, the permanent moratorium on e-commerce duties, just to name a few. I think we also need to add a provision on use of non-discriminatory services standards, particularly for digital services standards. In services, I think largely the disciplines in USMCA are quite good, including for areas like generally cross-border delivery of services, but also things like logistics and other areas. Financial services is another area that's very important. It's certainly in electronic payment services, but writ large in the financial services space. So I would say that all of those are very, very good building blocks to start on.
My time's expired. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Sewell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. I'm sure that you're all very busy as you try to navigate the chaotic trade policy that's coming from the White House. I represent a trade-dependent state, the state of Alabama, and right now, Alabamians are hurting. Last year, Alabama exported over $26.8 billion in goods, which supports over 90,000 jobs in my state, but many of those jobs are now at risk. My constituents are scared and confused. They don't understand why this president is attacking our allies and starting trade wars, which will devastate exporters and raise costs for working-class Alabamians. Trump's billionaire friends can survive a downturn in the stock market, but I can tell you that the people that I represent, the thousands of people that I represent, are hardworking Alabamians who cannot withstand such a reckless trade war. Therefore, while I am a supporter of opening markets for Alabama exports, I have serious reservations about giving this president any additional trade authority that he could use to destabilize our economy. Ms. Claassen, Alabama's farmers and manufacturers would love to have access to new markets to sell Alabama products and services. However, it is hard for them to focus on expanding into new markets when their current exports are so uncertain. Our two largest exporting markets are Canada and Mexico, but that market access is being threatened by trade wars. Why should Alabama farmers and manufacturers be optimistic about potential new trade agreements if President Trump could turn around and sabotage that by using the International Emergency Powers Act to invoke tariffs or through other unconstitutional actions.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think your question puts a finer point on the differences between the way that the statutes are set up, those that allow the president to raise tariffs for limited purposes under national security for a limited time, and those
Limited purposes.
Yes, and those that allow him to negotiate tariffs down. And so for many years, that bifurcation, as I said earlier, those that have based on raising, those allow him to raise tariffs have gone unchecked, while those allow him to lower tariffs. Congress has actually put more restrictions on your engagement between the two branches on those issues.
Absolutely. You know, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution plainly states that Congress has the power to regulate trade. It is clear that President Trump lacks the authority to enter into binding trade agreements without Congress granting trade promotion authority. Does President Trump currently have trade promotion authority, Ms. Clausen?
No, he does not.
If Congress doesn't give Trump this authority, how do you suppose the president would dodge Congress and bypass the Constitution?
When we look back at the trade executive agreements that have been concluded over the last several decades, in those instances when challenged, the executive branch has said the basis for some of those agreements have been a variety of different things. Most importantly, USTR's what we call organic statute, the statute that sets up USTR in the first place. But if you look closely at that statute, it doesn't actually give USTR negotiating authority. Rather, it sort of sets up that USTR is an entity that should report both to the president and to Congress. So there's been a discrepancy between what the executive branch has reported out as the authorization and what the statutes actually say on the books.
Well, do you expect that potential agreements with India or with the UK or Kenya would be mini or phased in like Japan, and would that have that kind of authority?
Well, I can't speak to what their plans are specifically with respect to those countries, but I encourage the subcommittee to set up a framework through which the branches can work together with respect to those countries or any others.
Absolutely. You know, as President Trump continues to defy the rule of law and erode the separation of power, what can Congress do in the trade space to reclaim authorities provided to us in the Constitution? For example, should we consider reforming the International Emergency Economic Powers Act or Section 338 of the Trade Act? Any suggestions as to how we can reclaim the authority that is so blatantly given to us by the Constitution?
So there's a broad menu that would take us more than the remaining 30 seconds to discuss, whether it's revising on the agreement side, a fast track, whether it's adding more publishing and reporting requirements, bringing back tariff decision-making to the Congress, narrowing justifications that the executive can rely on. Bottom line, as you pointed out, Congresswoman, Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, and so it has the right to choose the instrument through which the executive carries out that work.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Estes for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to join the Trade Subcommittee today, and thank you for all our witnesses for joining us. The district I represent is a cross-section of the United States. There are rural farmers and ranchers working to feed, clothe, and provide energy for the entire world. There are skilled workers manufacturing airplanes and aerospace components, and workers developing and building computer instruments that power our devices. And all of these industries benefit from free and fair trade. When the United States has a level playing field, Kansans do better. Unfortunately, unfair treatment by foreign countries and a lack of urgency to advance trade by the Biden administration has harmed our country. There's no question that countries like China have been cheating. The CCP not holding to its trade promises shouldn't shock anyone. They've been doing it for 70 years. Other countries have piled on extraterritorial taxes and tariffs on the United States and gotten away with it. All of this puts our American manufacturers and producers at a disadvantage. But the Biden administration was absent in enforcing the good policies of the USMCA, the U.S.-Japan trade agreement, and the China Phase 1 agreement. Additionally, there was virtually no movement on expanding markets in the past 4 years or pushing back on discriminatory tariffs. The momentum that was built in the first Trump administration came to a grinding halt. Now we need to reverse the stagnation and deliver free and fair trade policies to encourage economic growth and open markets for our producers and manufacturers. There's an opportunity to capitalize on the Biden administration stalled trade agreement with UK and Kenya. President Trump has shown that he will use every tool available to provide long-term economic opportunities. Just the threat of tariffs has brought some of our allies to the negotiating table and also spurred new investments in our country. And I'll remind my colleagues that tariffs were first used in the Trump administration, but inflation remained low, and then President Biden kept many of those in place. We can all agree that the United States will benefit from a return to stability and certainty in the marketplace, but first we need to level the playing field and ensure that foreign countries end their discriminatory tariffs and taxes that are a burden on our economy. I'm pleased to see that just today, India has announced the repeal of its equalization levy, which is a form of digital services taxes that India first imposed in 2016. This equalization levy focused on online advertising, and like other types of digital services taxes that trading partners around the world have imposed in recent years, it was always designed to target American companies. Chairman Smith, with your permission, I'd like to submit an article communicating this announcement from India for the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Ms. Bliss, do you have any perspective on either India's equalization levy specifically or the importance of addressing digital taxes that discriminate against U.S. companies around the world?
Thank you, Congressman Estes. Yes, and certainly the elimination of discriminatory DSTs are a priority for my members. And with respect to India's action, I think it's a very positive announcement that was made by the finance minister with respect to the 6% levy on advertising activities. And it comes after the announcement that the Indians made last year in August that they would eliminate their 2% levy on online services. So I think that's a very, very positive step in the right direction. More generally, unfortunately, we still have a huge problem with DSTs, and I would point to Canada with its 3% tax on revenue from certain digital services and the fact that that would be applied retroactively. I think it's a huge problem. It would be a major cost to U.S. companies that are affected, so that remains a serious problem. I also think it remains a serious problem in Europe with the failure of Pillar 1 in the BEPS negotiations. You have roughly half of the European members, European nations that are members of the OECD, either talking about or having in place DSTs. So yes, Congressman, we absolutely agree that it's a major problem and one that absolutely needs to be addressed in terms of our negotiating priorities.
Oh, thank you for that. And I just want to make a comment. I don't really have a question, but Mr. Root, when you were talking, you gave some specific examples of unfair tariffs that were placed on your company's products. And I think it's important for us in a hearing like this that we get that information out so that all of my colleagues are aware that we should not acknowledge that punitive tariffs are already targeting American companies, and we need to focus on having an administration in place that actually focus on how we benefit American companies through that. So thank you for bringing that up. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Davis for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sanchez, thank you for convening today's hearings on America's trade agenda and priorities, which is of great importance to our nation. And while we may not agree on many things around here today, one thing I think we all should and could agree on is that a robust trade policy is essential to maintaining productivity and growth across all economies, be it international, national, state-based, or local. For my home state of Illinois, our major trade partners happens to be Canada, China, and Mexico. So recent executive branch trade and tariff-related actions targeting these three countries will ultimately have great impact on our businesses, farmers, manufacturers, consumers, and our overall economy. To that end, it is important that the executive administration respect and recognize that Congress has authority over trade agreements, and its purpose is to guide and or direct the administration on the content of that agreement. Unfortunately, what we have seen from the Trump-Musk administration in the trade and tariff space over the past month has been anything but comprehensive, well-balanced, and measured. In fact, the president's recent approach to advancing his America First trade policy has been confusing, chaotic, inconsistent, and even contradictory. Clearly, the administration's haphazard approach to America's foreign trade policy and enforcement efforts fall short of the robust and comprehensive trade policy with respect to working with Congress to advance America's trade agenda. And measured as we look at markets, we certainly have not been protecting those. Tariffs are instruments usually used to address unfair trade practices like anti-dumping and countervailing duties, where other countries are selling goods at lower prices that hurt our industries and workers. So when Congress gives away its capacity to question and dialogue with the other branch, we weaken our position and risk deals that don't reflect all American values or economic priorities. Professor Clausen, given your experience both in academia and in government, how concerned should we be that the trend toward executive-only trade agreements, combined with the hollowing out of key agencies under the current administration, could weaken our ability to negotiate comprehensive, enforceable trade deals, especially those with strong labor and environmental provisions? And under what circumstances must foreign commerce involve congressional approval to ensure its legitimacy, enforceability, and long-term viability?
Thank you, Congressman. The first thing I would say in response to your question is that the trade executive agreements, not only have they for some time fallen under the radar, but because they haven't had the attention from Congress, they've also sometimes fallen under the table, and that's not the situation that one wants to be in. Second thing is in response to your point about having strong labor and environment protections. As I mentioned earlier, those are, of course, have been most available and emphasized when we've been working with Congress, when the executive branch worked together with Congress, either under Trade Promotion Authority or otherwise. So those are two reasons why it makes good sense for the branches to work together in crafting new trade agreements going forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Yakum for 5 minutes.
Thank you to our witnesses for being here, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this important hearing. It's time for America to start negotiating trade deals again. The Biden administration began negotiations for an Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, with 13 countries in the region, but this trade pillar never got across the finish line. Mr. Kirkland, you said in your testimony that American beef exports face a 30% tariff in Vietnam and a 50% tariff in Thailand. Did the Biden administration's IPEF negotiations prioritize lowering these tariffs?
Yeah, to answer your question very simply, no. Unfortunately, the IPEF agreement never touched tariffs, and tariffs were off the table entirely.
Thank you. And you also flagged that Australia, as a country with non-tariff barriers for American beef exports, did the Biden administration's IPEF negotiations prioritize addressing these barriers to ag exports?
I was aware of those discussions, but at the end of the day, nothing ever materialized from them.
So they didn't get it done?
Nothing.
Thank you. In fact, the Biden administration fact sheet on IPEF listed its top agricultural priorities for their negotiations as promoting climate-smart, sustainable production practices, optimizing land, water, and fuel use, and contributing to climate change mitigation and adaptation, food security, and resiliency. If you read these without any context, you wouldn't even know that I was talking about a trade negotiation. Mr. Root, Harley-Davidson exports face exorbitant tariffs and other fees from IPEF participants like Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, and India. Did the Biden administration's IPEF negotiations prioritize lowering these tariffs on the exports of your iconic motorcycles?
Thank you, Congressman Yakin. As I look, I think the awareness that we would have as to some of these specific negotiations are limited.
As a matter of fact, the Biden administration clearly did not prioritize these, which is why a number of overseas countries are still charging tariffs on Harley motorcycles. In fact, India, despite its massive tariffs, wasn't even a participant in this trade pillar. Ms. Broadbent, I agree that we should be pursuing negotiations for a trade agreement with the UK. I'm actually a co-sponsor of Chairman Adrian Smith's United Act, which authorizes UK trade negotiations and lays out Congress's priorities. I'm also proud to say that my home state of Indiana was the first to secure a state-level agreement with the UK. But this feels a little bit like a Groundhog Day because President Trump already began negotiations for a UK trade agreement during his first term. During the 4 years of the Biden administration, did it meaningfully advance trade negotiations with the UK?
I can't say for sure. I mean, I think it just went a lot slower, and their comments were, we're stepping back, we're going to look at small business issues, and they were not announcing that they wanted to do a comprehensive agreement with the UK. They did some meetings.
But did not
really
meaningfully advance trade negotiations with the
Right.
UK. I think that's very fair to say.
I think that's fair.
Great, thank you. Ms. Bliss, the EU's regulatory regime has shifted or stifled innovation, but it's not enough to kill its own industry. It wants to drag the rest of the world down with it by creating onerous regulations, worded in such a way as they just so happen to mostly target American companies. Should the federal government help American companies innovate, grow, and export, or should it be helping foreign governments put up barriers to keep American companies out?
Well, I think it's very important that the U.S. government, as the White House indicated in the presidential memorandums and executive orders, that it was interested in removing unfair barriers. And I think the EU would be right up there, whether it's in cloud services or how it's administered, its DSA and DMA, and also in the area of DSTs. I think it's very important that the government remain involved in removal of those trade barriers, as well as assisting.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to turning the page on a trade agenda from the last 4 years that didn't seemingly be interested in trade to one where we actually negotiate trade deals as opposed to help other countries put up trade barriers for our great American companies. Let's have an America First trade policy. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Appreciate the gentleman yielding back. Again, thank you to our witnesses for sharing your insights and your expertise. Obviously, I think we can agree that there's opportunity on the horizon to perhaps work together across the aisle with various objectives, though, to sell more of our products and to keep various perspectives in mind across our economy. So Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and the answers from our witnesses will be made part of the formal hearing record. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.